I'd like to welcome everybody to Acts session number 60. We'll be covering at chapter 27, verses 1 through 26. We think we'll be able to get through that. This is really kind of the famous shipwreck narrative that we're going to get into. But remember, last week we finished chapter 26, and Festus and King Agrippa basically just washed their hands up and said, this man's innocent. If he would have requested to see Caesar, or that we could probably release him. Well, we know that that probably wouldn't happen. So we kind of ended it last week with them saying we got no other choice but to send him to Rome since he appealed to Caesar. And so that's how we pick up chapter 27 is Paul finally gets to make his trip to Rome. Probably not the way he envisioned it, I'm sure, but God knew the way it would go. And so chapter 27 is the famous chapter around Paul's trip to Rome, the shipwreck, what happens. And quite honestly, I've glazed over it many times and didn't think much of it. But this single chapter, according to many commentators, is the most studied chapter in the Bible. You say, well, you sure that's accurate? I really don't. No. But the fact is, not only is it studied by Christians, it's studied by all types of people interested in historical navigation, because it gets into the level of detail of what happens to the ship going across the Mediterranean. And this type of vessel that was used back in 2,000 years ago. And it really goes into a level of detail that's found in no historian document. And so it has been studied extensively way outside Bible study, and has been found to be authentic all the way through and substantiated the things that Luke is actually saying went on. So it's really interesting when you get into this and we look at it. It's probably not a lot of theology that we're going to cover, but there's a lot about navigation and what was happening back in those periods of time. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Annette and let her start off on verses 1 through 6. And the first thing she's going to do, give you a picture of the ship.
I'm just going to let you see about what this ship looks like. It's a single mast. It does not have a rudder. And we might get into more detail, but it is steered in the back with these two paddles. When there's not enough wind, it can be driven through that. So kind of a blunt little machine. That's you. And so that's what it looks like. The other thing I'm going to show you, and I have little bits and pieces of this while we're studying, but this is the map. So they start off here in Caesarea. We're going to go today to Sidon. We're going to come up around Cyprus to Myra, and then Cnidus, and down to Salmon, Fair Havens, and they were attempting to get to Phoenix. We're going to talk about these. And then next week, we're going to get to this next week, they're going to crash on Malta. But right now, I shouldn't have told you in advance what was going to happen. I ruined the spoiler. But this is just the map, and so you can kind of see the route that they were taking. So let's go to this first section that is verses 1 through 6 of Acts 27. And when it was decided that we should sail to Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to one named Julius, a centurion of the Augustan regiment. So entering a ship of Adramyttium, we put to sea, meaning to sail along the coast of Asia. Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us. And the next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him liberty to go with his friends and receive care. And when we had put to sea from there, we sailed under the shelter of Cyprus, because the winds were contrary. And when we had sailed over the sea, which is off Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing to Italy, and he put us on board. So you see there is a lot of moving parts happening here. So my first question is, who is Aristarchus? Does that name sound familiar to anybody?
Yes.
It does sound familiar. What did you remember about him?
Well, he's another prisoner.
Okay, he is. He actually is. But his name means best ruler, and the best prince is kind of the meaning of this name. But he's a fellow worker with Paul, and he has been with Paul for quite a while. He's first mentioned back, we talked about him back in Ephesus, when, if you remember, there was the angry mob that rose up against Paul because they were the metal workers that were making the little statues to Artemis. And because Paul, so many people were being saved in Ephesus, they were getting furious because their income was plummeting. And so at that time, the crowd rose up and wanted to take Paul captive and probably kill him. They wanted to kill him, but they couldn't find Paul, so they grabbed two of his fellow workers, and one of those was Aristarchus. And so we know he's from Thessalonica, and we don't know much more about him. We don't know when he became a believer. There's been speculation that he was a Jew that was converted to Christianity, and then there's other speculation that he was a Greek. So we don't know specifically about him. We do know that he is mentioned several times in Paul's letters and throughout. So he was quite a long time. So he started probably before Ephesus, but he was with Paul through much of his, through Rome and through the end of his life. He was also considered a prisoner. So he was also a prisoner. And we see mention of him in Philemon, where Paul is saying that he sends his greetings, and so do Mark. Remember, this is interesting because Mark was the one that he and Barnabas split over because he wouldn't let Mark go on the second journey because he bailed out on the first journey, but we see Mark has come back with him here. Then we have Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke. Those were mentioned in Philemon. And then I think also there's a mention, I'm not finding another one. So we do see him in Acts and that, but we just know he was a very faithful follower and co-worker with Paul, as well as a co-prisoner.
Right, and the next question here is.
So was an ancient Greek astronomer and mathematician, not the same one, but his name was preceded this particular one. And with a name like Aristarchus, he was probably Greek rather than, he probably came in as a Greek, if you will, rather than as a Jew.
Yeah,
That's just
Thessalonica. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, well, one of the things here is, how is it that Luke and Aristarchus are committed to travel with Paul first? And let me go back. How do we know Luke is there? Did y'all pick that up? Because Luke's name's not mentioned anywhere, is he?
Plural pronoun, first
Right.
person, we.
It says
Right.
we sailed. That's exactly right. And so we got to be careful. Luke has been out of the picture for a little while. We don't see this we business during the trials that we just went through. Luke is probably around, but it's not written in Luke's voice. Here, this is written mostly in Luke's voice and his tone. So very, very different here that he's with them. But back to this question, how is it that Luke and Aristarchus are even permitted to be with Paul? One I guess, thing came up. Well, maybe they were both prisoners.
No, Luke wasn't a prisoner. Luke was just, if you will, a journalist. He was gathering information for his writings, and because he wasn't a Jew, he was a Gentile, and
That's correct.
he was, how do I want to say, no serious threat in that capacity to the Jews, and so the Jews probably weren't jumping up and down. Oh, look, you can't let that guy go with him. He's going to write a history about Paul and make us look bad. So I think that he was sort of like wearing his journalist credentials to hitch a ride. That's just a thought.
And we don't have a clear answer, But what we do have a clear answer is, this is completely against Roman law. A prisoner cannot have people along with the prisoner. So they're probably either prisoners, or the other option they could be is Luke and Aristarchus could have claimed to be slaves of Paul. By being Paul's slaves, they would be permitted to accompany him. So that is a possibility as well. We don't get a clear picture of that either. We do know, though, that this is a prison ship when it left out of Caesarea. It means it's full of prisoners. Most of these prisoners are going to be executed. These are prisoners going on this ship that are going to be fed to the lions or put in the gladiator courts, and they're going to be used for entertainment. They're going to be executed. Some of them may be waiting trial. Some of them may be appealing to Caesar, but not all of them, I'm sure, are. So this is a very secure ship with a bunch of prisoners that they're taking to Rome, either for additional trial or for execution. So it would be very unusual for the Romans to allow anybody to travel with a prisoner, much less allow a prisoner off the ship, which we'll get to. So I think the last thing, which we didn't see in the commentary that we looked at, but I think is probably the case. I think Luke and Aristarchus is ministering to Paul, and Paul is ill. He's not of good health right now. And so if you recall, Luke is a doctor, he is a physician. So I really think Luke and Aristarchus is either have claimed to be a slave so they can go with Paul, or they're his physicians, his personal physicians, and that he's ill and they want to get him to Rome alive and they think they need to take him. The other possibility is Festus, knowing that Paul was innocent, gave Paul some liberty with Julius. Festus may have met with Julius and say, look, Paul's no threat. We have tried him. We find nothing wrong with him. He appealed to Caesar. So to Caesar, he's going to go, but he's really no threat. We don't know what the answers are to this, but it's really interesting that they are accompanying Paul along this trip. Remember, this is an expensive voyage to go from Caesarea to Rome. And so I don't know that the Romans would be freely paying for two freeloaders to ride along the ship to get to Rome for free. But anyway, all those are just comments. There is no real clear, accurate answer to the question itself.
Hey, Dave.
Yeah.
This ship was not only a prison ship, they had prisoners on it, but they had cargo. They were a commercial vessel. Because it says that all you would lose would be the grain and not any lives would be lost. And so I think.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, they're going to change ships.
Yeah, let's go back to the first slide. Right here. If you look
right here,
or what's happening is they're leaving Caesarea.
Right.
And the ship they're on in Caesarea
it's a prison.
Yeah, maybe carrying grain. We don't know. We weren't told that. But it is a prison ship, and it's a very small ship because it hugs the coastline. This ship would never venture out into the Mediterranean without having the coast very close to it. So it was really a smaller ship. It was a prison ship for what we know. But you're right, we do hit another ship, and we're going to get to that towards the end of our study tonight. And it's interesting, the next ship, and it is a grain ship. You're totally right. And so we're going to hit that.
And this is the grain ship, this one.
That's the grain
not
ship.
The prison.
That's the grain ship.
We didn't have any info on that.
Right.
Hang on, I think the grain ship is the Egyptian ship.
It is. It is. We haven't gotten to it, but it is.
Right.
They pick up the Egyptian ship right here, the ship from Alexandria. They get right here.
And
And right now we're here.
Right. And it technically may not even be an Egyptian ship. We'll talk about that when we get to it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Before we leave Julius, I believe that I believe some commentator said that Julius participated in some of the trials as an observer, and that he essentially knew that Paul was innocent and that Paul should have been declared a free man by one or both of the individuals that were in charge. And because of that, I think that he looked upon Paul as, someone who is not guilty and thus is entitled to his freedom as such, to the limited extent that he, Julius, could extend that freedom to him. But Julius's job also was not just to bring Paul there, but it was to protect Paul in the transit, if you will, from those Jews that wanted to kill him.
Yeah, and we heard the same. So I would think that that's probably accurate to some degree. We had commentators that said he could have been present. What was interesting, though, he was an Augustan he was from the Augustan cohort or regiment, and that is an elite group of soldiers that really did very special service, almost like Secret Service, and protected Caesar and did protected food coming into Egypt, even on the Egyptian ships. So they were an elite group. That was who he was a member of, and he's over 100 men. We do notice most of the centurions we run into in the book of Acts are really men of high caliber. And, the Romans did a good job selecting their men, at least in their soldier ranks. We can't say in their politician ranks. Of course, I think United States is about the same way, but we do a good job in our soldier ranks, not so much on our politicians.
Our next question is, what was the risk to Julius specifically for allowing Paul liberty to go see his friends? And there's a couple of things that we might think here. We know that that he could have felt there was no risk at all. But what we do know is if a Roman that was charged with guarding a prisoner or delivering a prisoner, if that prisoner escaped, then that person charged with the task of bringing them in had to serve their sentence. So we're thinking, well, he might have thought there wasn't a big risk because Paul's not convicted. He's not guilty. He doesn't have a sentence he's going to serve. So if he doesn't come back, there's no loss. The other thing, there is a loss, but he's saying that there's nothing for him to serve. So he's not going to do that. Although they could be also executed for failing to bring a prisoner in. But Paul, again, is not really a prisoner. He's not sentenced. The other thing is we feel like that Paul was a godly man. I think he had a godly behavior and a godly character in everything he did. And I think Julius probably felt comfortable that he could trust him. If I ask you to come back, will you come back? So we think that we just know that he could be doing that. And in addition, he let him have these traveling companions, and no other prisoner on the ship would have been afforded these liberties. So we know that we don't think that he felt like he was taking a risk. If he did feel like he was taking a risk, I think he felt like he could trust Paul.
With that, what does it mean that Paul was released to receive care? And this is what I went back to earlier. It's this statement here that makes me believe Paul is ill. And remember, Luke is accompanying Paul off and on through this journey and ministering to Paul. So I really think, and what this really means when you look at it from what we could determine, is that he went in and gave him liberty to receive medical care and to be refreshed and get back, because you're right. His job was to deliver Paul alive, protecting both against the Jews and also if he was sick, giving him care. So I lean to believe that Paul was not very well. He was ill. Luke and Aristarchus was with him to minister to him. And when they got to a city, they actually released him, let him go into the city and get care there. So again, I may be wrong, but it seems like that's the reason that this is all tied together. The next question is, what do we know about Sidon? And I'm not going to go into much detail here at all. It's mentioned in Matthew 11:21 through 22 by Jesus himself. It's basically a city of wickedness and evil. It did not come up under Jewish rule. We do know that eventually a church was planted there because they do go in and there are some believers there. Oddly enough, it went completely back the other way between then and now. It's very Muslim right now, that city, and very anti-Christian. If you went into that city today, you probably would not make it out if they knew you were a Christian. So it's a very dangerous place for Christians itself. But really, that's what we know about it. It's a real city. It still exists today. May not be up under the same name. I didn't research that, but I think it really is up under the same name. But it's noted to be completely Muslim dominant and that it's anti-Christian completely. And so it was a very wicked city back then. And that we know, Jesus makes reference to its wickedness even in Matthew as well. So that's what we know about it. So we go to the next question.
Just a moment. Where was Jezebel from?
Ooh,
Jezreel or
Jezebel.
No, that's where she lived with Ahab. She was
Yeah.
from either Tyre or Sidon, which is twin cities up there in the Phoenician area. And
They
I
are.
think there's a lot of Baal worship. I could have it wrong, but I think I'm right.
No,
you're right.
She's from that
Ty is,
coastal area.
yeah.
And she
Tyre
brought all
is
of her
a
Baal
sister
worship
city.
with her from there. So
Right.
you're right about what you're saying
Right.
about the area, Dave.
Yeah, and you're right. Tyre is a sister city about 22, 25 miles from it. And it is in the Phoenician area. Totally right.
Okay.
and it was a Baal was a very big problem in
Right.
these areas. You're right. The last question is what now we're getting into the cargo ship. So what's the significance of boarding an Alexandrian ship? We kind of went into it a little bit, but that means that, as it was brought before, this definitely is a cargo ship. So they've gone from a prisoner ship that was just kind of a small coast hugging to a seafaring ship. And so at this time, really their only option to go the distance all the way to Rome by sea would be to do it on a cargo ship because they didn't have any passenger ships. They had no Princess or Norwegian cruise lines going back and forth. So
Not even Carnival?
Not even
Carnival or Royal Caribbean. Not even Caesar didn't even have a Royal Caribbean. So what we do know is that Rome had a contract with Alexandria for grain. And so the grain would be brought up on these ships to feed the Roman Empire. And we already explained how it was made without a rudder, but it has these oars and a single mast. And it was kind of a short, stout boat. So it was really good for moving through the sea, but it was not good at taking winds and waves head on. So it wasn't really equipped for that, which is why they were careful when they sailed. And we'll kind of get into that a little bit later. Generally, they're about 140 feet long, about 36 feet wide, not that big. Width-wise, and so they're really sturdy, but they're not that great with direct wind. So what we do know is have cargo, probably other things in addition to the grain, but the grain was the contract that this ship was signed under to go back and forth.
Right, and they had a very deep draft as well. And sail ships usually have a big keel in the bottom of it. There's no mention of that, but there was mention it was over a 30-foot draft. That means it needs a minimum of 30-foot water to go into, which again, the ports are limited that you might be able to get into it out of it as well. So that will go to the next section of scripture. In verses 7 through 12. And when they had sailed slowly many days, and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus. Cnidus, and why is Cnidus called? Why's that twice? Is that what it says?
No.
Okay, I'm sorry, we have a typo here, so I'm reading exactly what it says, but it says, and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus. The winds not permitting us to proceed, we sailed under the shelter of Crete of Salone. Passing it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, a city near Lake Phacea. Now, much time had been spent, and sailing was now dangerous because the fast was already over. Paul advised them, saying, men, I perceive that this voyage will end with a disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also our lives. Nevertheless, the centurion was more persuaded by the helmsman and the owner of the ship than the things spoken by Paul. And because the harbor was not suitable to winter there, the majority advised to set sail from there also, if by any means they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, opening towards the southwest and northwest, and winter there. So what we run into here is a situation where we're given many things in this verse that we're going to look at that tells us the timing and what's happening. So the first thing that comes up here is, what does it mean that the fast was now over?
Yom Kippur.
Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, is over. When is that in our calendar time?
September, October.
Yeah, it's around the October time frame. So sometime in that range. It was noted by historians that really the time to sell to move grain to really eat from Egypt to Rome. Remember, Rome didn't have a lot of agriculture when it came to grain. They got most of that from Africa, and they had shipping contracts that went back and forth. A lot of the ships were actually owned by the Roman government. So we don't know what kind of ship this was, but that's another whole thing. But the fact is that when it came past September, around September 14th in our calendar, it became dangerous to sell because of really frontal systems moving through. And just like the East Coast, you heard of a nor'easter. This area was plagued, and really starting in September, you started to have danger into about mid-November. And from mid-November on, nobody sailed the Mediterranean until you got to the spring and those winds died down. That's how treacherous it was. So they were moving into this, and remember, they kept moving slow. They weren't making headway. Time was coming off the clock. And so this thing saying the fast was over, it's now they're in a really dangerous, but not impossible situation to get to Rome. And so that's what this is all really talking about.
So there is a disagreement that arises. What is this disagreement?
Paul is disagreeing with the captain and the centurion.
Okay, that's exactly right. So Paul is suggesting that the ship should go ahead and winter in Fair Haven, which we have down here in Crete. So he's saying, look, it's late in the fall. This is not the time that you should be traveling. We should pause here in Fair Haven for the winter. And remember, you can say, well, Paul was not a seaman, so why would he have anything to say about this? But Paul was an experienced sea voyager. He had been many, many times on a ship. And in 2 Corinthians, it tells us that he had had a shipwreck 3 times. So I think this is going to be the 3rd time. He might have had a couple of other. Okay, that he'd already been shipped. So this is going to be his 4th. So he probably felt like, he kind of could feel that and he probably felt it was common sense. Everybody knew not to travel this time. But then you have the owner and the helmsman disagreeing because they don't want to stay in Fair Haven. And I'll let Dave go in the next or I think I'm gonna pick that up at the end. No, Dave is why it's not a suitable port. But this disagreement comes up. And so the next question is, so who is he disagreeing with? The helmsman and the owner? And the interesting thing about that is if you go back to the original word, helmsman, when I heard that, I thought that was the guy maybe that rowed the boat, but I didn't know what it meant. And you'd think, well, what, the owner? Why is the owner on the boat? They said that this really could be better translated the pilot and the captain. So the one that navigates, steers, and then the captain that makes all the decisions and runs the ship, that's most likely who this was. And the true owner could have been the captain, but generally was going to be a company or even a nation that would own that. What we do know, and it's also not really unusual that the centurion didn't make a silly decision to follow the helmsman and the owner as opposed to Paul, because Paul's not a salesman, a sailor, and these guys, that's what their living is, and certainly they have much more to lose if anything happens to the ship or the cargo. So he felt like he could put his trust in them, that that's where it was valid.
And the thing that we get out of this is a hard lesson that we should recognize, that it's human nature to make decisions based upon logic and science, and people who the lesson here that we're getting out of here is that it's human nature for someone to follow educated people or follow the scientific path over what God may be telling them to do. And that's exactly what Julius did. Julius listened to call it the captain, the pilot, or whatever, that's what they do for a living. Paul was a missionary. That's what he did for a living. Though Paul had a message from God, Julius is basically saying, I'm going to go with where the knowledge is, the scientific knowledge. And when you look at our educational system, you look at our young people coming up, and not just them, many times they lean towards going towards the scientific side because it's more logical, it's more explainable, and not go to where God is directing them. And so it's not surprising at all Julius went with where they were directing him instead of where Paul was directing him. So we shouldn't think poorly of Julius at all at this point. Okay. So what we know about Fair Havens, that's why it's not suitable for wintering. Anybody have any comment before I go into that as far as what we know about that area?
The direction of the winds in the winter did not make Fair Havens a safe place to to stay, and the community may not have been suitable for, if you will, feeding hundreds of prisoners or dealing with the crew. That's just my thoughts on it.
Yeah, and that's what it really means. It wasn't suitable for port in which to winter. And Collins, that both of those are correct. And there may be a third one as well that I'll mention, but it was a more shallow port. It was not protected from the northeast winds like it should have been. So it was not a port that a larger ship would winter at. So that's what it meant, unsuitable. The other side, you're right. We know that was 267 people aboard here. Some of them prisoners, some of them crewmen, and we don't know who else. And so that city didn't have the means to maybe support that many people, call it hotel rooms, lodging, food, and all the other things. But the last bit of this is these are sailors who are away from home for months at a time. And if they're going to harbor for the winter, they're probably going to want to harbor in a place. This is not a bunch of believers. This is a bunch of most likely pagans. They want a fun city. And New Havens wasn't noted to be a fun city to spend your winter in. So you notice that it said everybody was in agreement to sail on. So it wasn't just the captain and the helmsman or the pilot or whoever. it was all of them wanted to stay there. Paul was the only one that said we needed to stay here. So it was all those reasons that really they persuaded them. But the last thing here is looking at the map, you'll see that Phoenix, it's only about 40 miles, northwest of where Fair Havens is. So it's not very far, and it's actually along the coastline. So every indication is, they should be able to make it. And Phoenix was known for a large harbor, very well protected, and they felt like it was worth the risk to get there.
So let's go to the next section, verses 13, 19. And when the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their desire, putting out to sea, they sailed close by Crete. But not long after, a tempestuous headwind arose called a Euroclydon. So when the ship was caught and could not head into the wind, we let her drive. And running under the shelter of the island called Claudia, we secured the skiff with difficulty. When they had taken it on board, they used cables to undergird the ship, and fearing lest they should run aground on the Syrtis sands, they struck sail and were driven. And because we were exceedingly tempest-tossed, the next day they lightened the ship. And on the third day, we threw the ship's tackle overboard with our own hands. So what is a Euroclydon? Euroclydon.
Yeah.
So what is that? Easy, other than very impossible to say. Euroclydon. I think it's a Euroclydon. What is that?
It's a northeast cyclonic wind that occurs in the Mediterranean that makes sailing very dangerous.
It is basically a winter hurricane. If you know what a nor'easter is, it's not the same as a nor'easter, because a nor'easter really only happens off the coast of North America, the northern coast of North America, northeast coast. And this is happening in the Mediterranean, but it is a cyclone type storm with the northeast winds. And
Could be hurricane force.
it could be hurricane force. And it was so bad that basically there was nothing they could do. They just pull in the sail and they couldn't steer it. The oars were useless in this type of a storm. And so they just let it go.
Right. One of the things we do note here, before I get to this next question, is the winds this time of the year weren't that favorable anyway. And when this wind kicked up, that made it not favorable, it made it impossible. But the currents actually were very, very good about taking the ship without wind. It could take a ship because the currents actually went from east to west. And so the ship could be moved along quite easily by the current if the winds weren't bad. So when it said it had gentle winds from the south, that meant they could make a little bit of headway. And that was what was so optimistic. But what is this Syrtis sands, that they're concerned about? And why is that mentioned? What do we know about the Syrtis sands?
There were two areas in the Mediterranean Sea, right? There was an east and a west Syrtis sands. The east was closer to Cyrene, and it was off of obviously the African coast, and the one on the west was in the vicinity between Carthage and Sicily, and it was a very dangerous environment for sailors to get blown into, because their ships would basically become stuck and they may never get out. Also because they were called quicksand, which apparently meant that they were not suitable sandbars for the sailors to get out of their ships to, if you will, to make it to safe to the shore.
Yeah, and all that is accurate. That's exactly right. The issue here is it was known that if you got stuck on these sands or rocks, you're probably going to die because the sandbars came so far out from the land. There was no way to get off the boat, even if you were stuck, and get to the land. And so they were very, very dangerous. Collins is right. And so that's basically what they were fearful of. They knew if they wound up there, they truly were toast at that point.
So how did they lighten the ship? Kind of, we're given the steps here. The first thing they did, so you can think of the dinghy or the lifeboat or whatever they're dragging along behind is causing drag. So they bring the skiff aboard and fasten that. Now they're undergirding. This is where we're seeing kind of the steps that were taken in times of crisis. And I cannot figure out how they got cables and things up under this boat to secure it because, I mean, they didn't have good fasteners then. It was more like a wood fasteners. I forget what that's called. But they didn't have, they used lots of pitch and things to cement it together or glue it together. And so they girded it. So then the first thing to go was the cargo. The next thing to go was all of the tackle. And tackle is a little bit unclear. I think what I hear about tackle on a ship now is the elements used to run the ship. But other people say, well, this is everything on the ship that wasn't nailed down or that they could unnail and get. So they threw everything over they could. I think they were thinking of getting rid of prisoners next or passengers next, but that's how they.
Yeah, and before we go, this is a trivia question. What other book in the Bible talks about this same type of event being caught in a tempestuous wind and being caught in a windy environment? Anybody know? Jonah. Yep, chapter 1 of Jonah. Very similar if you go back and read Jonah chapter 1 of what they did and what was happening here.
It's an interesting contrast, though. Jonah was running away from God.
Absolutely.
I was just going to say.
Whereas Paul's going with, according to God's wishes. And Jonah is believed to be the cause of the trouble, of the storm, and thus is like tossed over. Now, there are two key words that I'd like to toss out at this time, no pun intended: jetsam and flotsam. Have you all heard of those two words? Jetsam and flotsam. Jetsam is what is tossed overboard intentionally. Flotsam is basically the wreckage of a ship or its cargo floating on or washed up by the sea. And while there may have been some flotsam as a result of what the individuals on that vessel were doing, it was intended to be jetsam.
Now, when neither the sun nor the stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest beat upon us, all hope that we would be saved was finally given up. But after a long abstinence of food, then Paul stood up in the midst of them and said, "Men, you have listened to me, and if you had listened to me, you should have listened to me, and have not sailed from Crete and incurred this disaster or loss. And now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. And for there stood by me this night an angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar. And indeed, God has granted you those who sail with you. Therefore, take heart, men, for I believe God that it will be just as it was told me. However, we must run aground on a certain island." So what is the significance, this first question, that there's neither sun nor moon, for many days.
They didn't have the North Star. They didn't
Yeah,
have
there
any of
was
that.
no guidance.
Right. Yeah, and the only way to navigate in those days was either by the moon, by the stars, or by the sun, which they had none of those. So that's what really made it that they had no clue where they were, basically.
Do you
No
think-
GPS.
No
Right.
GPS.
Do you think Paul was rubbing it in when he said you should have listened to me?
Absolutely.
I think so.
Yeah.
That's funny because I kind of took it the other way. I didn't think really Paul was rubbing it in. I think he was just pointing out, look, you can see now that what I said before was valid and you should have listened to me. So because of what I said was before I would like you to listen to what I'm saying this time and know that it should be true. He could have been rubbing it in, but I really do feel like maybe he was just pointing out because it was true. I was right here. Listen to me this time.
Yeah, and we
What
had
would
a
they
master.
have done?
Annette,
sorry.
what's the difference between if and should? If Paul had said, if you'd have listened to me, that's a big difference of meaning than you should have. You should have. And Annette, here's the important thing. If we're a skiff, we'd all be boating.
Let me ask you this question, and it's unanswerable, but it's an interesting question. When they had the opportunity to stay in Fair Havens, why didn't God speak to Paul then and say, tell them that your God says don't leave Fair Havens? Now, when he did that after the ship was in peril of sinking, they seemed to take at least courage. They ate because Paul said, the God who I serve says nobody's going to drown. We'll lose the ship, but nobody will drown. But why didn't God speak to him back in Fair Havens and he say, my God says we should not go? I don't know.
Free will. Free will.
Free will.
Yeah, that's a good question, Herb. I mean, God's timing, who knows? I don't think you can.
God has a longer plan, I think. His
Yeah.
longer plan is they got to go to Malta, believe it or not.
Yep. So the next question here is, did you note the power shift that occurs here?
The
Yeah.
what ship occurs?
What power is shifted here?
Oh,
And
it's to Paul. It's
Yeah.
From the centurion, from the master,
Yeah.
from the crew, the owner,
Right.
and if you will, I don't want to call it a mutiny because they didn't throw the centurion and any of the Augustan band off the ship. I think that they became the how do I say, the individuals to whom everyone looked to for guidance, what to do.
Yeah, so it's very obvious Paul, a captive prisoner, has now become captain of the ship. And they are listening to him. And if we go back and we look at what happened, is that when they were shipping, there's a dinghy they pull along, or a skiff they pull along. They put that in, they wrap ropes around the ship to try to secure it. But all that going down, Paul had a vision. Now, some people say that it wasn't really an angel as we think of an angel, but it was Christ appearing to Paul, telling him. So that's up to you which way you go. Whether it was an angel, was it a reappearance of Christ that's telling Paul that? We don't know. Herb, I don't know why he didn't appear when they were sitting in a safe port, but it's God's providence, it's his plan. So with that, we'll go to the next question.
I'll just say for Herb's question is a good question. And we have no idea. It's just not documented. But through this, how many people might have become believers seeing that God spoke to Paul and Paul was able to speak God's words to them, and that we might have had
And they actually did
some
get saved.
lives. Yeah, you might.
See,
we
we
never
are
know.
through this. We are through this kind of shipwreck almost not daily, but often in our lives. And oftentimes we don't particularly have a guidance from the Lord. it says that man plans his path, but God orders his steps. Now, the path was planned and they went by ship, and God didn't interfere with that. But when the steps came to where life and death were on the line, God appeared in the form of the angel who spoke to Paul. And I think that's the lesson for us, that we have to understand that he's not going to tell us what next step what path to take. But if we put our foot in the wrong place and we begin to sink, just like the Peter began to sink, he's got a handout for us. I think that's
Very good.
important.
Good point.
Very good.
Next one.
What might we gather from Paul's statement that all of the men had been granted to him? So the angel tells them, not only you, but all the men have been granted to you. What that was an interesting phrase, we thought. What do you think that means?
There was prayer out there somewhere.
That's what we thought. We thought that most likely Paul had been praying all along, not just for himself to keep himself safe, but I think he had been praying for everybody on that ship. And I think it probably started when they left Fairhavens, and he knew that was probably, he wasn't comfortable with that decision. And I think he probably started praying for this journey and praying for these, and that for God to say, hey, I am granting you all the men on the ship. That was a good, a nice, again, a reminder of how God provides and takes care of us.
Yeah, and the next question is really getting back maybe to you, Collins, is recognizing what word is in some translations and not other translations here. But what does it mean that Paul believed God?
In contrast to Jonah, Jonah was like, no, I'm not buying that. And he ran. Whereas Paul, on the other hand, says, okay, I believe God, and I'm going to profess my faith to others. So I think this is one of the lessons for all of us, is for us to share our faith in God, our faith that we believe God.
Herb, you had
In the
anything?
Amplified, in verse 25, it says, men, let's see, so keep up your courage, men, for I have faith. And the explanation of faith is complete confidence.
Right. Yeah, some
in God that it
translations.
would be.
Yeah, some translations say faith. That's exactly right. That's the difference between when it says I believe God and I believe in God. What you're talking about when I believe God, that is faith. That's exactly right. When you believe in God, well, even the devil believes in God. That doesn't mean you follow God. So the end is missing between believe and in between believe in God. And what that means is that some translations is taking it faith in God versus believe. So it's just an interesting way to look at this. This last question we've already kind of discussed. I think Herb already hit on this. It's a lesson that is really for us today. That we're going to go through tribulations and we need to follow God. But you look at Paul and the way Paul handled this, he always stayed of good joy, regardless of what was going on, always had faith that God was going to deliver him from whatever the circumstances were. So the lesson there really is we're going to go through tribulations, and we should be looking at Paul as an example. Always. And that's hard. That's a hard thing to do. That's Paul marching orders, because it's very difficult to stay encouraged and encourage others when the world is crumbling around you. But many say that's the test of a real character of a person, is when things are going down and that person steps up in the middle of that to keep it all together. That's where true character shows. And that's what we get out of Paul here. We see his true character. So with that, we're up right against our time frame. Any last minute comments or last minute questions or before we move on? We apologize for the internet connection. We'll try to fix the video. We're going to have a backup plan next week on this, though.
It's fine, Dave. Don't Don't worry about it. We got all we needed to get, I think.
Let's
Appreciate
close
it.
in prayer.
And then we're done.
Okay,
Our dear Father, thank you. Thank you that we got through this lesson despite technical issues. You're the God overall, and the discussion was great. And I think that we do need to recognize that we will be going through storms. And again, as we pray for this nation and we look at where our society is going, the storms are coming. And we're going to have our own cyclones to go through. So I just pray that we remember Paul, the example he is, remember to have faith that you are there beside us. You're carrying us through and lifting us up. And I just pray that this lesson would be an encouragement to us and that it would help us to help others. Be with us as we go through this